In the next three sections, I tend to some of the more predominant issues of consumption and distortion. In the second section, violent context and its distortions, I review the similarities and differences as well as the interplay between non-fictional and fictional representations of violence as these distort various violent realities associated with the social construction of race/ethnicity, gender, and class. In the third section, violence in cinema in postmodernism, I explore the topic of violence in the arts and in relationship to society as a whole, not as some kind of cynical or academic exercise divorced from repressed anger and alienation, or as some type of given functions of human nature, but rather as cultural artifacts embodying specific ideological assumptions about society in general and advanced capitalism in particular. In the fourth section, sexually and non-sexually violent media, omitted from this presentation, I would have reviewed the similarities and differences, the availabilities and the consequences of the mass-mediated consumed representations of violence, both sexual and non-sexual. In a related fifth section, violence and media context, that has also been eliminated from this afternoon's presentation, part of the thesis can be deduced. What I would have done there is provided summations about the direct and indirect effects of mass-mediated violence on real violence and social control. And in doing so, I would have reinforced a central thesis of this evolving work that society and social science alike need to be more concerned about consolidated media and its influences on mass consumers and less concerned about mediated violence and its influences on interpersonal violence. While the latter tends to be more of a diversion or a sideshow to the actual production of violence and nonviolence, the former tends to be more of a narcissistic hedonism or cultural escapism from the ensuing production of violence and nonviolence. In the interconnected processes of media consolidation and mediated violence, then, the articulation of violence becomes inextricably caught up in the increasingly alienating positions of inequality and privilege, or of order and insecurity that are currently being distributed locally, nationally, and globally. All right, mediated consolidation and the development of advanced capitalism. During the current period of rapid media consolidation, or in an age of mega media mergers, people debate the regulation and deregulation of the industry, the role or lack thereof of the independents and the public sectors, and whether or not more is less in terms of sheer numbers of programs and diversity versus the homogenization of the message. More importantly, however, as best-selling author and Wharton School economic fellow Jeremy Rifkin points out, in the age of access, the new culture of hyper-capitalism, where all of life is a paid-for experience, the global struggle between commerce and culture is altering both the conception and reality of the world around us. He argues that, quote, the commercial sphere's effort to subsume the cultural sphere and become the sole arbiter of the human story represents a great turning point in the relationship between commerce and culture, with profound long-term consequences for every society, end quote. In terms of a fossil-based economy and the worldwide communications web of today, or a hydrogen-based economy and the worldwide energy web of tomorrow. Rifkin also recognizes the democratic impulses and efforts to resist the capitalist domination of culture with its reproduction of hierarchy, privilege, inequality, and most importantly, intensifying conflict and violence. Significantly, he articulates these struggles as struggles involving the fundamental redistribution of power on Earth. With respect to mass culture and mediated violence in particular, Christopher Sherritt, a professor of communication studies and the editor of The Mythologies of Violence in Postmodern Media, has underscored the fact that although the media are frequently pointed to as culprits in fostering a climate of violence, little effort is made to determine what exactly the media are, the political and economic interests they represent, and the ideological assumptions they perpetuate. It is not only that most public discussions about power and the influence of mass communications ignore the political and economic interests of the media, but these discussions of the media assaults on all of us remain essentially divorced from the concept of the media's primary role or function in relationship to the development of advanced capitalism. In an age of global capitalism, with its intensification of profits and its penetration into areas of public, private, and cultural space, the media increasingly become little more than advertising venues for the stimulation of mass consumption. For example, in the United States, one immediate aftermath of 9/11, in effect, became a marketing tool used to urge consumers to actively spend rather than to passively conserve. Similarly, in terms of the political and ideological use, left or right, of the media, all sides not only subscribe to the hegemony of free enterprise and extreme individualism, but they are dependent on these practices for their very existence. Their social relations of cultural production, in other words, are caught up in the emergence and development of what has been called a national entertainment state, or NES, referring to the consolidation of the ownership and monopolization of the distribution of newspapers, books, magazines, films, radio, video, television, software, and the internet. Among the mega corporate conglomerates, there are such media fiefdoms as General Electric, Disney Cap Cities, Westinghouse, and the former AOL Time Warner, each having consolidated both vertically and horizontally. Among the consequences of this kind of media consolidation is a significant reduction in and near elimination of the independent producers from broadcasting. For example, it is claimed that 90% of the top 50 cable TV stations, as well as the top 20 internet news sites, are dominated by these media conglomerates. And in terms of production, consumption, and circulation of mass culture, both the intensification of the bottom line across all of these shared economic interests and the emergence of infotainment, or the triumph of entertainment over pure news, as exemplified by such television news shows as ABC's 2020, CBS's 60 Minutes, and NBC's Dateline, tend to reproduce a homogenization and recycling of images, texts, and narratives that shape and influence our collective dreams and nightmares. This is accomplished essentially, as the political and news analyst Walter Lippmann argued a half-century ago, through the formal and informal relations that limit public discourse and manufacture mass consent. In other words, the consolidation of the NES and the commodification of communication with its pursuit of advertising dollars act as buffers, if not censors, on our cultural understandings of social reality.